Okinawa, May 1945. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of cordite. Rain drizzled across the shattered cliffs of the Maida Escarpment, a place American soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge. Japanese machine guns watched from concealed caves, their barrels glistening in the humid dawn. Every inch of ground was paid for with blood. Below, scattered across the slope, the wounded cried out, men torn apart by shrapnel, some too far gone to move, others praying for the impossible. And then, amid the chaos, a figure appeared. He carried no rifle, no bayonet, only a canvas medic's bag clutched to his chest. Crawling through mud, dragging bodies one by one, he moved deliberately into the same fire that had just destroyed his unit. The Japanese snipers hesitated. They could see him clearly now, the small, wiry man kneeling beside a dying soldier, his lips moving in quiet prayer before he lifted the man onto his shoulders and vanished into the smoke. By nightfall, whispers had spread even among the Japanese lines. The Americans had a medic who did not die. The story of the unarmed soldier who defied an army is one of Second World War's most incredible legends. Subscribe to see how one man's faith conquered a battlefield. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a grinding test of endurance. Nearly 4 years had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor. What had begun as a swift Japanese expansion across the Pacific had turned into a brutal, island-by-island reversal, a war fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with belief and resolve. For the United States, every victory carried a higher cost. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each island was a name etched in sacrifice. The further American forces advanced toward Japan's home islands, the more desperate the fighting became. The Japanese military, guided by the ancient Bushido Code of Honor, considered surrender a shame worse than death. To die in service to the emperor was to die pure. This mindset shaped the Pacific battlefields into landscapes of annihilation. Japanese troops rarely retreated. Entire garrisons were wiped out rather than captured. Civilians were often coerced into mass suicides, told that the Americans would torture and kill them if they were taken alive. The result was a conflict stripped of mercy, a psychological inferno where compassion itself became suspect. In this environment, American soldiers learned to expect no prisoners and give no quarter. The brutality bred mutual hatred. Prisoners of war were treated harshly, often executed on sight. Propaganda on both sides painted the enemy as less than human. It was a war of absolutes, victory or extinction. By early 1945, the Allied High Command knew that Japan's military culture would make any invasion of the home islands catastrophic. Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before Japan itself, became the proving ground. The island was defended by more than 100,000 Japanese troops, entrenched in caves, bunkers, and tunnels carved into its limestone ridges. Facing them were American divisions, hardened by years of combat. But even they were unprepared for the scale of resistance they would meet. Among the soldiers landing on Okinawa were men of the 77th Infantry Division and the 96th Infantry Division, tasked with seizing the island's southern ridges. The final obstacle before them was a sheer escarpment 400 feet high, a natural fortress the Japanese had turned into a killing field. It was here, on this unforgiving slope, that the paths of two worlds collided: the Imperial Japanese Army's code of death, and one man's unshakable belief in the sanctity of life. The man was Desmond Thomas Doss, a 26-year-old U.S. Army medic from Lynchburg, Virginia. A quiet Seventh-day Adventist who refused to carry a weapon, he volunteered to serve not to kill, but to save. His decision bewildered his commanders, angered his comrades, and defied military logic. To fight without a gun in a war where even medics were armed was, to most, insanity. Yet Doss believed violence violated his conscience and his faith. Thou shalt not kill was not negotiable. He could not take a life, but he could risk his own to preserve others. By the time his unit reached Okinawa, many of his fellow soldiers still doubted him. Some called him a coward, others refused to stand beside him in battle. But the Japanese defenders, though they had not yet met him, would soon come to see him differently, not as a coward, but as something uncanny. For amid the firestorms that raged across the Maida Escarpment, they would witness an unarmed man who kept returning into the inferno and coming back with the wounded. again and again, as if death itself could not find him. Desmond Thomas Doss grew up in the foothills of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, far from the noise of war, in a modest home shaped by poverty and faith. His father, a World War I veteran scarred by trauma and alcohol, often clashed with his mother, a devout Seventh-day Adventist. Their household was divided between pain and prayer, but young Desmond found refuge in Scripture. One image from the family's framed 10 Commandments stayed with him for life. A picture of Cain standing over Abel, the words "Thou shalt not kill" carved beneath it. When the world plunged into war, Doss's faith didn't let him ignore the suffering around him. He couldn't stay home while others risked everything. But he also couldn't betray his belief that life was sacred. So in April 1942, he volunteered for the U.S. Army, not as a rifleman, but as a medic. From the moment he enlisted, his convictions made him a target. At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, his refusal to carry a weapon infuriated his superiors. Fellow soldiers mocked him, beat him, and threatened him. "You're not a real soldier," they told him. "You'll get us all killed." When ordered to train on Saturdays, his Sabbath, he quietly refused. When commanded to handle a weapon, he declined again. The Army branded him insubordinate. His commanding officers sought to court-martial him, hoping to remove the troublesome private before deployment. But Doss remained calm, polite, and resolute. His defense was simple. He wanted to serve his country, and just not by killing. Eventually, after military tribunals reviewed his case, Doss was allowed to continue his training as a medic under the legal status of a conscientious objector. Even so, few believed he would survive combat. In Guam and Leyte, he proved them wrong. During fierce engagements in late 1944, Doss exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire to treat the wounded. He dragged men out of the jungle, performed field surgeries with bare hands, and prayed over dying comrades. He carried no weapon, but in battle his courage became its own shield. By the spring of 1945, Doss's division, the 77th Infantry, was assigned to Okinawa, the final and most violent stage of the Pacific Campaign. Military strategists called it Operation Iceberg. The island's capture would bring American forces within striking distance of mainland Japan, but at a terrible cost. Okinawa was not just another battlefield. It was the last fortress of the Japanese homeland. The Imperial Army's 32nd Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had transformed the island's southern ridges into a labyrinth of tunnels, pillboxes, and artillery nests. Their objective was simple: inflict maximum American casualties, delay invasion, and die with honor. To the Japanese, an enemy who refused to fight back was incomprehensible. In their code, mercy equaled weakness. Surrender was disgrace. The Bushido ideal demanded defiance to the end. Yet soon, on those same cliffs, they would face a man whose strength came not from defiance, but from compassion, and whose faith would challenge everything they believed about courage. The Maida Escarpment, later immortalized as Hacksaw Ridge, awaited. A 400-foot cliff, rising almost vertical, laced with cave positions and crossfire lanes that turned every inch of the plateau above into a death zone. For 2 months, American assaults were repelled with devastating losses. Men called it suicide to climb that rope ladder again, but Desmond Doss was not finished. He had seen enough death to know that life, however fragile, was worth saving. Even one more. And when his battalion was ordered to take the ridge in May 1945, Doss would enter history, unarmed, unarmored, and utterly unafraid. War is designed to erase humanity, yet within that machine, some individuals manage to preserve it, to act with empathy even when surrounded by brutality. Desmond Doss was one of them. He carried no sidearm, no grenades, not even a knife. His only tools were bandages, morphine, and prayer. To the soldiers of the 77th Infantry Division, this seemed almost suicidal. On Okinawa, Japanese forces did not distinguish between medics and riflemen. Red crosses painted on helmets often became targets. Saving others meant running straight into the open, into rifle fire, mortars, and machine guns that turned men to dust in seconds. But Doss's strength was not physical defiance. It was moral endurance, a kind that unnerved both sides. He treated the wounded regardless of rank or race. Japanese soldiers, too, sometimes received his care when found dying on the field. In moments when vengeance ruled, Doss practiced compassion. To the Americans, that made him almost otherworldly. To the Japanese, it was disorienting. This was a man who refused to hate, who defied the logic of war itself. His comrades began to notice something strange. Doss seemed untouched by fear. When shells burst near him, he ducked only to shield the man he was treating. When a sniper cracked from the ridge, Doss moved slower, calmer, as if guided by something unseen. Soldiers who once mocked him began to follow his example, speaking softer to the wounded, protecting medics more fiercely, whispering his name with reverence. Faith, in the hell of Okinawa, had become a weapon stronger than steel. From a military standpoint, Doss's work bordered on the impossible. The Maida escarpment was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a maze of hidden tunnels and interlocking fields of fire. Japanese machine guns swept every approach. Mortars exploded without warning. Snipers waited hours for a single exposed target. Yet Doss moved through this terrain with methodical precision. His medic's training taught him to navigate chaos with purpose. Every rescue followed a rhythm: crawl, stabilize, drag, prey. He memorized the positions of friendly lines and enemy strongpoints, using smoke, terrain folds, and crater shadows to conceal movement. Unlike soldiers burdened by weapons, his light pack allowed him to move quickly and quietly. When others advanced under covering fire, Doss often worked in silence, guided only by the cries of the wounded. He became a ghost among explosions. On the night of May 5, 1945, when his battalion was ordered to withdraw after heavy losses, Doss refused to leave. Dozens of men lay scattered across the plateau, bleeding out in the dark. One by one he crawled to them, treated their wounds, and lowered them down the cliff with a rope sling he tied from spare stretcher webbing. Each time he sent another man down, he whispered the same prayer. "Lord, please help me get one more." He worked for nearly 12 hours without food, water, or rest. When the last body was lowered, the ground was carpeted with empty shell casings and the faint trails of blood leading back into the smoke. His movements that night became the stuff of legend, not because of strength, but because of discipline, training, and a refusal to yield to terror. In purely tactical terms, Doss extended the reach of his entire unit. Every man he saved meant one less casualty for replacements to fill, one more soldier to return to the fight. His heroism wasn't random, it was operationally significant. To the Japanese defenders, the war on Okinawa was sacred. They were fighting not merely for land, but for honor, emperor, and family. Indoctrinated since youth in the Bushido code, they viewed the Americans as morally corrupt, weak men who feared death. They believed that true warriors did not surrender, and mercy was a luxury the battlefield could not afford. When the Japanese spotted Doss repeatedly entering the open, they hesitated. Through binoculars, officers saw a lone medic dragging bodies under fire, often stopping to treat the fallen. At first they assumed he was a decoy or part of a trick, perhaps bait for a counterattack, but he kept returning, even when they had full opportunity to kill him. Some soldiers later claimed they deliberately held their fire, believing the strange medic to be protected by the gods. In the eyes of men taught that courage came only through death, Doss embodied a different kind of power, one rooted in selflessness, not destruction. The very idea of fearing an unarmed man was alien to them. Yet fear crept in nonetheless, the fear of something they could not explain. When American units later found enemy diaries on Okinawa, some entries mentioned a ghost medic who carried no weapon and could not die. To the Japanese, such tales blurred the boundary between human and divine. On that ridge, amidst the collapse of empires and the exhaustion of men, an unarmed medic had quietly undone centuries of martial certainty. Among soldiers, fear is a constant companion, invisible, contagious, and corrosive. It spreads in silence, in glances, in the way a man grips his weapon a little tighter when the night goes quiet. On Okinawa, fear ruled the ridges, yet Desmond Doss seemed immune. His calm unnerved the men around him. He neither cursed nor panicked. When others clung to the ground during bombardments, Doss was already crawling toward the next cry for help. That steadiness became a psychological anchor for the 77th Infantry Division. Veterans later recalled how his presence seemed to slow time. Amid explosions and screams, Doss's voice stayed level, firm, soothing, almost detached. "You're going to be okay," he'd say. pressing a dressing to a wound while bullets snapped through the leaves overhead. For men living on the knife edge of terror, that calm was magnetic. It pulled them back from the brink. His faith, once mocked, became a psychological shield for others. Soldiers who had cursed him for refusing to fight began to whisper prayers of their own when he worked beside them. Even enemy snipers began to lose their nerve. Rumors spread among American lines that Japanese marksmen would not shoot the medic. Not out of mercy, but superstition. Some claimed they believed he was protected by a divine power. Whether true or not, that belief had tangible effect. Fear began to shift sides. The same fear that had once made Doss seem weak now made him untouchable. Courage, it turned out, was not the absence of fear, but mastery of it. And in mastering it, Doss changed how men around him measured their own strength. Military leadership is built on obedience, discipline, and firepower. A man who refused to bear arms, refused to train on Saturdays, and quoted scripture under fire was, by all traditional measures, a liability. Yet by 1945, Doss had become indispensable. Captain Jack Glover, one of his commanding officers, had once tried to have him removed from the unit. Glover later admitted that he'd misjudged him completely. On Okinawa, he saw Doss do what no armed soldier could: move freely under fire, retrieve the wounded from impossible positions, and hold the line of morale together through sheer will. Leadership is often about presence. Doss commanded no rank, yet his quiet endurance became a moral compass for officers hardened by war. When he worked, others followed. When he prayed, even atheists fell silent. Reports from the 307th Infantry detail instances where units refused to advance without Doss accompanying them. Soldiers claimed they felt safer when he was near. It wasn't superstition. It was the trust earned through countless rescues. Commanders began adjusting tactics to protect him, not because he was fragile, but because they could not afford to lose him. The chain of command, which once viewed him as an obstacle, now recognized him as the soul of the battalion. In military history, such transformations are rare. Doss never sought leadership, yet he achieved it in its purest form, by example. At the heart of war lies a paradox: the more efficiently one kills, the more power one holds. Desmond Doss inverted that equation. His power came from restraint. In a time when killing was glorified as duty, Doss's refusal to take life stood as silent defiance against the logic of total war. His bravery forced everyone, comrades and enemies alike, to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the capacity for mercy might be the highest form of strength. This moral inversion unsettled both sides. American soldiers began to question what kind of world they were fighting to preserve. Japanese observers, steeped in traditions that equated honor with death, could not reconcile how an unarmed man could be so fearless. What Doss represented was not weakness, but conviction so absolute that no threat could move it. His faith was not naive, it was militant in its consistency. It demanded sacrifice equal to that of any warrior's code. When Japanese troops learned that the same medic who saved Americans had also tended to their wounded, even they, who in their diaries and interrogations after the war, described him with awe. They feared him not because he wielded a weapon, but because he represented something invincible, moral purity in a place built on moral collapse. And so, as the fires burned across Okinawa, an extraordinary transformation took place. Men who once judged him now drew courage from him. Enemies who sought to kill him came to respect, even revere him. In the ruins of that island, Desmond Doss became proof that the battlefield could still hold room for humanity, that even amid total destruction, the choice to heal could be more powerful than the command to destroy. The ridge, however, was not yet won. As the sun rose on May 5, 1945, the Japanese prepared one of their fiercest counterattacks. A storm meant to wipe out every American position on the plateau. And once again, the unarmed medic would be at the center of it. May 5, 1945. The morning broke gray and silent over Okinawa. The sea beyond the cliffs shimmered faintly, its calm surface mocking the violence about to unfold. On the Maeda escarpment, the 307th Infantry Regiment gathered at the base of the ridge, staring up at the jagged wall of rock that loomed above them, 400 feet of sheer limestone, riddled with hidden caves. This was the third attempt in a week to take the plateau. The last two had ended in slaughter. The Japanese defenders had perfected the art of invisible warfare. Machine guns were hidden behind bamboo screens, mortars fired from buried tunnels, and snipers were perched in the dark recesses of the ridge face itself. Every foot gained by the Americans was measured in bodies. At 5 a.m. the assault began. Naval guns offshore pounded the crest. The ground shook with concussions. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Then the barrage stopped, a deceptive silence before the climb. One by one, the soldiers began their ascent, clutching the thick cargo nets draped over the cliff. Each man climbed into the unknown. Some prayed. Some cursed. Desmond Doss climbed last. His medic's bag hung against his chest. His Bible was tucked inside his jacket pocket. He carried no weapon, only gauze, sulfur powder, and morphine syrets. When the first wave reached the top, they met immediate resistance. Machine guns erupted from every direction. Men fell backward off the cliff, torn apart mid-climb. Mortars rained down on the slope. Within minutes, the ridge was transformed into a cauldron of death. Those who survived the initial storm pressed forward, inch by inch, clearing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. The smell of burning fuel mixed with rain and blood. Screams echoed through the smoke. Doss moved among them without hesitation. Wherever a man fell, he crawled. When ammunition ran low, he tore open bandages instead of cartridge belts. He ignored shrapnel wounds to his own arms, his uniform soaked through with other men's blood. Witnesses described seeing him drag soldiers from exposed ground, shielding them with his body as he applied tourniquets. When shells burst nearby, he flinched but did not stop. A rifleman named Carl Bentley later said, "He just kept going and as if he didn't hear the bullets." Hours passed. The Americans gained only a few yards before being driven back. The order to retreat came through. Bugles sounded below. Men scrambled for the nets, wounded screaming for help from the plateau above. Doss stayed behind. He could hear them, scattered voices calling in the dark. He couldn't leave. Not yet. As the sun sank behind the ridge, the battlefield fell into a twilight of smoke and embers. The Japanese, believing the Americans had withdrawn, began moving through the wreckage, searching for survivors to execute. Doss crawled between their patrols, pulling the wounded toward the cliff edge, whispering reassurance to keep them silent. Then, using a length of rope he'd scavenged from a shattered litter, he fashioned a makeshift sling and pulley. Alone, he began lowering the wounded down the cliff, one man at a time. Each descent took minutes, minutes that felt like hours, each one under the eyes of unseen snipers. As his hands blistered and bled, he prayed, "Lord, please help me get one more." Below, the men waiting at the base couldn't understand where the wounded were coming from. Bodies appeared from the mist, sliding down one after another. Some thought it was a miracle. Others assumed a team was working up top. Only later would they realize it had been one man, all night. By dawn, Desmond Doss had lowered more than 70 men to safety. Some were barely conscious. Others were presumed dead until revived by his care. When morning came, the plateau was littered with the aftermath of his work, empty stretchers, blood-stained bandages, and the faint smell of morphine mixed with the smoke of spent gunpowder, and yet Doss remained above. He refused to descend until he was sure there was no one left alive. At some point during the rescue, shrapnel had torn through his leg. Later, a grenade blast would wound him again. Still, he continued crawling through the carnage, dragging himself by his elbows to reach one last soldier. That night, Hacksaw Ridge was not defined by conquest, but by mercy. And while the battle would rage on for days to come, something profound had already shifted. In a place built to kill, one unarmed man had proven that the will to save life could endure longer than the will to destroy it. Inside the caves of the Maida escarpment, Japanese soldiers waited. The air was thick with the sour stench of sweat, cordite, and decay. Their uniforms were torn, their rations nearly gone, but their discipline held. Each man knew his duty, fight to the last cartridge, then the last breath. Lieutenant Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the senior strategist under General Ushijima, had designed the ridge defenses to bleed the Americans dry. His troops called it the Fortress of 1,000 Deaths. The plan was simple: strike, vanish, and strike again. When the enemy retreated, the Japanese would emerge from their caves to finish the wounded. No mercy, no hesitation. But on the night of May 5th, something was different. After the Americans withdrew, scattered movement still flickered across the plateau, faint, deliberate, and unarmed. Through the mist, Japanese lookouts saw a figure moving between the bodies. He did not fire. He did not flee. He carried men on his shoulders, lowered them down the cliff, and came back for more. At first they thought it a trick and perhaps a trap designed to expose their firing positions. Snipers took aim but hesitated. The figure never crawled with soldiers. He always came alone. When they fired near him, he did not react like prey. He moved with purpose, almost peacefully. For hours they watched him. Every few minutes, another American body disappeared over the ridge edge, lowered carefully by rope. The same silhouette returned each time, even after artillery bursts illuminated the smoke around him. One Japanese corporal later described it in his post-war testimony. "We saw a man who did not hide from bullets. He seemed to walk between them. Some men said to shoot him, others said not to. There was fear, not of his gun, but of his spirit." In a culture that revered death as the highest proof of loyalty, the sight of a man risking everything only to preserve life was incomprehensible. The Bushido Code taught that compassion was weakness. Yet this unarmed medic, this man who refused to kill, showed a kind of courage that transcended even their own understanding of honor. To those huddled in the caves, Doss's persistence began to take on a supernatural quality. They whispered that he must be protected by the kami, the spirits of war. Superstition spread faster than orders. Some refused to waste ammunition on him, believing the gods would punish any soldier who killed a man so selfless. The psychological effect was subtle but profound. For the first time in months of fighting, hesitation rippled through the imperial lines. Warriors who had accepted death as inevitable now felt uncertainty, the creeping sense that perhaps their enemy's faith carried a power their emperor's call could not match. Down below, the Americans had no idea of this unseen reverence forming in the enemy ranks. They only saw the results, their wounded arriving by the dozens, all rescued from what had been declared impossible ground. At dawn, when Doss finally descended, he collapsed at the base of the cliff, his hands shredded, his arms trembling from exhaustion. His face was pale and hollow, but his eyes were steady. Around him lay the men he had saved, 75 souls, each one a defiance of death. Captain Glover, the same officer who had once tried to have Doss discharged, stood in stunned silence. He later said, "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." The battlefield above was eerily quiet. The Japanese had not pursued their usual dawn counterattack. Whether out of disorganization or some deeper hesitation, the plateau remained still, as if both sides, for one brief morning, had agreed on a silent truce born not of strategy, but of respect. When the fighting resumed days later, the ridge was taken, but not by overwhelming firepower alone. The spirit of one medic had changed the will of those around him. Soldiers fought harder, not for vengeance, but to justify the lives he had saved. Among the Japanese, captured diaries recovered after the battle told fragments of the same night. The American medic does not die. He moves like a shadow between the living and the dead. We feared him more than any weapon. In a war defined by hatred and annihilation, such words were astonishing. They revealed not weakness but recognition, an acknowledgement that courage can take forms beyond the battlefield's logic. By the time the guns fell silent, Desmond Doss had rewritten the definition of valor. He had faced an enemy that measured manhood by death and shown them a higher form of strength, the power to preserve life without demanding one in return. On Hacksaw Ridge, bullets could not kill faith. And even those who fought beneath the flag of the Rising, Sartim men raised to die without question, could not help but feel a shiver of awe before the ETC, unarmed man who would not fall. The ridge was finally secured, but victory carried a cost, and even miracles leave scars. What came next would cement Doss's legacy, not in legend but in history. The Battle of Okinawa ended, but the island was a graveyard. Over 12,000 Americans and more than 100,000 Japanese lay dead, along with tens of thousands of civilians caught between the two armies. The escarpment known as Hacksaw Ridge was now silent, a place where twisted metal, burned helmets, and splintered rifles told the story of unimaginable carnage. When the 77th Infantry Division finally secured the ridge, the medics began sorting the living from the dead. Among them was Desmond Doss, gaunt, pale, and nearly unrecognizable beneath dried blood and grime. His hands were raw from rope burns. His legs were barely holding him upright. But his stretcher was full, not with ammunition or rations, but with the wounded men he refused to abandon. Word of his actions spread quickly through the ranks. Men from other units, even those who had mocked him, came to see if the rumors were true. Could one man really have saved 75 soldiers alone, unarmed, under constant fire? It seemed impossible. Yet there were witnesses, dozens of them, who had seen him go back again and again, pulling men from the edge of death. Some had counted, others had lost track. The numbers varied, but the reverence was unanimous. When Doss was finally ordered to rest, he resisted. He continued treating others, even as infection set in. A few days later, a grenade blast tore through his legs, and as medics rushed to help him, he insisted they treat another wounded man first. When he was finally evacuated, he gave up his stretcher to a more critical patient and crawled instead. In that single act, his legend was sealed. Back in the United States, reports filtered through the military chain of command, fragmentary at first, then detailed. Officers who had once dismissed him now recommended him for the nation's highest military honor. Witness statements were gathered, timelines reconstructed. Every account told the same thing. Doss had saved his comrades one by one for hours under direct fire, without a weapon in his hands. When President Harry S. Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor on October 12, 1945, the ceremony was simple, almost understated. Doss, still weak from tuberculosis contracted during his service, stood quietly as the president shook his hand and said, "You're the bravest little man I've ever met." Even then, Doss deflected the praise. He insisted he was no hero, that any man could have done the same. But those who had stood beside him at Hacksaw Ridge knew otherwise. His courage had not come from rage or orders or survival. It came from conviction, a steadfast faith that life, even in the midst of destruction, was worth saving. Across the Pacific, news of Doss's recognition reached Japan through occupation newspapers. Some former soldiers, now prisoners, reportedly remembered hearing of the medic who walked through bullets. To them, it was proof that not every enemy was defined by cruelty. Even in defeat, the story resonated, an echo of humanity that transcended sides. But Doss's story did not end on the ridge or in the ceremony hall. The war had taken much from him, his health, his hearing, and his youth, yet it had also given the world a symbol of what moral courage could look like in its purest form. The battlefield had shown men every horror imaginable, and in the center of it stood one unarmed medic who proved that even in war's darkest hour, compassion could prevail. When Desmond Doss returned home, the war inside him did not end. He carried no medals in his heart, only memories of screams echoing across Okinawa's cliffs. The army doctors diagnosed him with tuberculosis. Years of battlefield exposure and deprivation had eaten through one lung and severely damaged the other. For 5.5 years after the war, he lay in hospital beds undergoing surgeries and treatments that left him permanently weakened. He never complained. In quiet hospital wards, when nurses asked him how he endured, he would simply say, "The Lord spared me for a reason." His Medal of Honor citation told the official story. He aided 75 casualties under fire. But the men he saved told another story, one of faith, humility, and absolute conviction. To them, Doss was not just a medic. He was a reminder that morality could survive the trenches. The army, once skeptical of conscientious objectors, began to rethink its stance. Before the war, such men were often ridiculed or imprisoned for refusing to bear arms. But after Okinawa, the military's perception shifted. Doss had shown that devotion to conscience could coexist with service to country, that bravery did not always carry a rifle. His actions forced the institution to acknowledge that moral courage could be as vital to victory as bullets or bombs. Even General MacArthur's staff referenced the Doss principle in post-war chaplain training, the idea that faith-driven resilience could strengthen morale, even among combat troops. Doss never sought such influence, but his example rippled quietly through policy, doctrine, and hearts. He lived a modest life in rural Alabama, working as a carpenter once his health allowed. Fame never tempted him. When Hollywood approached him in the 1950s to dramatize his story, he refused, fearing it would glorify war rather than highlight the power of compassion. Only decades later, in his old age, did he permit a full retelling, on the condition that the film remain true to the message of mercy above violence. He said, "I just wanted people to know that you can stand alone if you believe what's right." Desmond Doss passed away in March 2006 at age 87. He was buried with full military honors at the Chattanooga National Cemetery. The same flag that once flew over Hacksaw Ridge folded beside him. The U.S. Army marked his grave with quiet dignity, but halfway across the Pacific in Okinawa, locals still tell the tale of the medic who saved without killing. Modern historians estimate that his actions saved not just lives, but morale. His rescue of 75 men during the assault likely prevented the 77th Infantry from collapsing under losses. His courage gave shape to the concept of combat altruism, the willingness to face death purely for the sake of others. Even Japanese records recovered from field diaries echo the legend. Our translation preserved in the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Museum reads, "An American without a weapon walked among the dead. We feared his heart more than his army. Time transformed that fear into reverence." For veterans on both sides, Doss became proof that humanity could survive the machine of total war. His Medal of Honor was one of only 13 awarded to medics in World War II, and the only one ever given to a conscientious objector. But to those who knew him, medals were irrelevant. His legacy lived in every soldier who chose mercy over malice, every medic who ran toward the wounded, every believer who held to conscience when the world demanded conformity. On a ridge once drenched in blood, the grass now grows quietly. Birds nest among the rusted helmets, and the wind hums softly through the stone caves that once echoed with gunfire. The place that witnessed destruction now stands as a symbol of salvation, not through force but through faith. The battle ended 80 years ago. Yet the question remains eternal. What makes a man truly brave? History remembers its heroes in many forms, soldiers with medals, generals with maps, nations with victories. But every once in a while, it remembers someone who refused to fit the pattern. Desmond Doss stood unarmed in a world built on weapons. He walked into the storm not to destroy, but to save. In doing so, he revealed something quietly revolutionary, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph of conscience over it. On Okinawa, both sides were prisoners of their beliefs, Americans fighting for freedom, Japanese for honor. Between them, Doss stood alone, a man whose strength came not from steel but from faith. He believed that preserving life was worth dying for, and through that conviction, he became the embodiment of a paradox, a warrior of peace in a war that consumed millions. His legacy reshaped the language of valor. For centuries, armies glorified aggression, the charge, the victory, the kill. Doss proved that heroism could exist in restraint, that devotion to one's principles could withstand even the world's most violent test. He gave proof to the idea that morality need not be sacrificed on the altar of necessity. Long after the guns fell silent, his story endures, not as myth, but as memory. In classrooms, chapels, and military academies, his name is spoken with a mix of disbelief and reverence. Because what he did was not merely brave, it was transcendent. Every soldier who tends to a wounded comrade, every medic who runs through gunfire carries a fragment of his legacy. Every person who stands by their convictions when the world demands surrender continues his silent prayer. Lord, help me get one more. On that cliff in Okinawa, amid smoke and ruin, Desmond Doss redefined what it meant to fight. He showed that even in humanity's darkest hour, light can still endure, carried by the hands of a man who chose mercy over fear,